It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today to you. We thank you all for coming and hope that you'll enjoy the program. Our speaker today, as you all know, is Professor Dorothy Roberts. She is the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law at the Northwestern University School of Law, and she is also a faculty fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at that university. She earned her JD degree at Harvard Law School, and she is the author of more than 60 publications, some of which are actually on the required reading list here at the Adler School, I'm happy to say. Her current research interests are revolving around class, race, and gender, and the intersection of those items with biotechnology, bioethics, and child welfare. And she's going to share her current research thoughts with us here today in this talk and cover quite a few of those topics. So if you'll join me, let's welcome Dorothy Roberts.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. I am going to speak about a current project I have on race and biotechnology and how politics affects the intersection of race and biotechnology. So I think I have to point, there we go. Some of you may have noticed a series in the New York Times, the DNA Age, that Amy Harmon wrote. She won a Pulitzer Prize for it. And she pointed out some of the many ways in which genetics and the fascination with DNA is influencing life in the United States today. One millionaire she quoted said that he'd rather spend his money on his genome than a Bentley. Just an example of how genomics has become very personal to many people. And this company, Gnome, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, can sequence individuals' entire genome for a pretty hefty price. But people are predicting that in the near future, it will become cost-effective for companies to offer these services more broadly to the public. You won't have to be a millionaire to get it. But even before being able to sequence everyone's entire genome, there are now companies like 23andMe that offer to look at certain key genetic markers and tell you about your risk for certain diseases and even some personality traits. Their website says that you can provide a saliva sample with this at-home kit, and then you can use various interactive tools to tell you more about your ancestors, your family, your identity, and yourself. Now, not only do these genetic services give you information about yourself as an individual, but they're increasingly being used as a basis for networking, and some people would say even for citizenship. The New York Times ran this article about a DNA sample party that some celebrities participated in, not in the science section, but in the styles section of the New York Times, and couples that got together to spit into the vials and have their DNA sampled. So this is just, I thought I'd start with this one example of how DNA is now becoming fashionable. It's becoming part of people's lives, not just to give them information about their health, but also about their identity and about ways to link up with other people who have similar genetic traits. And in fact, Anne Wojcicki, one of the co-founders of 23andMe, describes a new type of community that's being created by DNA information, where people will come together around specific genotypes, and those artificial barriers of country and race will start to break down. In other words, the prediction is, as we find out more about our genes, we will see commonalities. We'll link with people according to genes and not according to categories like nations and, in particular, race. And this echoes what Bill Clinton and others said when the Human Genome Project was completed. Clinton emphasized that it showed that human beings were extremely similar at the genetic level, regardless of race, and that what is the most important fact of life on this earth is our common humanity. Again, this idea that genetic information will help to transcend barriers of race. And that only echoed what the American Anthropological Association had said 10 years ago, using genetic information to point out that genetic testing showed that race is not real, that it's a social construct, and it's not a natural division among human beings. So the American Anthropological Association had reached that conclusion some time ago. The Human Genome Project supported it, and new technologies are encouraging some people to think that genetics will overcome divisions based on race. Now, no sooner though than these findings came out about the similarities, the fact that human beings are 99.9% the same or something like that, the figures change. The NIH pointed out that 0.1% of difference is important, and it may explain why some people are more susceptible to certain diseases than others, and why certain medications work better on some people than others. So even though we're very much the same at the genetic level, that difference is significant. And what I found in my research project is that for many people, that genetic difference is race. In other words, human beings are 99.9% the same, but that tiny bit of genetic difference, which involves a lot of genes, explains racial difference. So the finding of our commonality, some people argue, doesn't mean that race doesn't exist. Race does exist in the amount of difference. So they'll point out, well, human beings and chimpanzees are 98% the same. You wouldn't say that human beings and chimpanzees are the same species. And so that commonality doesn't prove anything. And some people are also arguing that that difference is what explains unequal health outcomes and other kinds of differences we see between people of so-called races. And to give you an example of how, despite what many of us thought 10 years ago and 5 years ago was conclusive evidence that race, well, and we could go back to even longer before then, that race was a socially created category. Increasingly, we're finding that there is interest in proving that race is a biological trait and that there are biological, especially genetic explanations for racial differences. Here's a recent example of an article from the New York Times, A New Look at Race and Natural Selection. If you want to find lots of articles that purportedly show scientific proof that race is a natural genetic category, just Google Nicholas Wade, because he loves these articles. And this is one of his latest ones in the New York Times. And you don't have to really, you probably can't see this chart, but what the chart shows is on one side, various regional groups, and then also sites in the genome where these researchers say natural selection created differences among the groups. And so Nicholas Way concludes in April 2009, only a month ago, that the principal human races presumably emerged as the populations of each continent responded to different evolutionary pressures. Here we have in the New York Times, first of all, a statement that there are principal human races and a scientific explanation for how these races were differentiated, directly in contradiction to what the American Anthropological Association wrote in 1997, and in contradiction to what many social scientists and geneticists and others have said. But I think it is striking, this is just one example, that we're increasingly seeing a dispute over the idea that race is an invented category. At the very time that genetics was supposed to show that it was invented, that there was no genetic basis for distinguishing among races, at that very time is when we're seeing articles like this that state as a matter of fact that there are principal human races. In addition to this research that is trying to show that race is a legitimate category in human genetic variation research, and also using race as a genetic category in biomedical research, there has been an explosion of race-based biotechnologies and other uses of genomics in this country over even the last 5 years. One problem with working on this book I'm working on is that there's just too much going on every day. It gets bigger and bigger. There's more and more and more, and it's hard to stop doing research. But in addition to the basic research by geneticists and other genetic scientists, there is an increasing interest in race-specific pharmaceuticals. I'll talk about that. This will be the biotechnology I focus mostly on for this talk, although I could say more about other technologies as well. In reproduction assisting technologies, where race is just an assumed category, and to give you an example of this, just go on Craigslist and look for advertisements for eggs, egg donors. They're all according to race. Jewish egg donors wanted, Asian egg donors wanted, African egg donors wanted. Genetic ancestry testing, companies that, online companies again, where you send in a sample of saliva usually, and they say they can tell you what race you are, what proportion of different races you are. Some companies are specifically market their services to American Indians, some to African Americans, some to people of Jewish ancestry, to tell them what tribe they come from, or again, what race they belong to. And DNA forensics, which both is not specifically race-based, but as I'll mention later, will increasingly be focused on African Americans, and now that the Congress has approved collection of DNA from immigrants detained by the federal government, will probably become increasingly Latino. But in addition to that, companies that say they can identify the race of suspects using crime scene samples. So what I want to do is take up the admonition of Nicholas Rose, a British sociologist, who says that we should locate the current debates over race and genomics firmly within the transformed biopolitics of the 21st century. Now, when Rose writes this, he means that we are in a new era where people can take greater control over their health using genetic information, like information provided by 23andMe, for example. And that we shouldn't be so concerned about the connection between race and genomics, because we're in a new era where citizens have more control over their information, over their health. In fact, we should celebrate that, and especially in countries like ours that are liberal democracies. And as you'll see, I am a lot more skeptical about that celebration than Rose is. But I do think that he is right to say that we shouldn't view race and science as just a continuation of the relationship of the past. And I don't have time. I could give a lecture on the history of race and science. Of course, it's a very sordid history where science has been used to promote not only racial divisions, but hierarchies. The idea that whites are more intelligent, more gifted, more moral than others, and that people of color are inferior. Science, of course, has been a chief defender of that position for centuries. But I think that we do have to think about what is the significance of this explosion of race-based science and race-based biotechnology in the current era. What are these biopolitics of the 21st century that we need to place these scientific developments in? Now, unlike Rose, I would say the new biopolitics of race involves attributing health and other inequities to inherent racial difference, which today is described as a genetic difference. I think that it tends to hide the social determinants of inequities and focus on allegedly natural causes for inequality. And I think it can be a means of reinforcing racial inequality instead of undoing it, the way that some of the people I mentioned at the beginning are predicting. I think it could just as easily reinforce racial inequality in a new way, not in the same way it did 50 years ago, in a new way, and disguise the continuation of white privilege in a post-civil rights era. In other words, a way of explaining why it is that we continue to see such stark inequities along racial lines in this country, even though the civil rights era supposedly undid official discrimination. How does it happen? How does it continue? In every era, there's an explanation for it. And I think there's a big danger that in the 21st century, the explanation will be a genetic explanation. So in an article in 2005, David Satcher, the former Surgeon General, and his collaborators came up with this very, I think, poignant way of describing health inequities. And that is the excess black deaths in this country every year. And that is the number of deaths, it was 83,570 in 2002, that would have been prevented if blacks and whites had the same mortality rate. And as one of the authors said, that would be like loading up, I can't remember how many, but many, jumbo jets every day and crashing them, with just black people aboard and with no survivors. And maybe if that happened, people would say, hey, there's a problem here, we need to do something. But that's basically what's happening in this country. Black death rates from a whole host of diseases so outstrip white death rates that there are these large numbers of excess black deaths. Now, how do we explain those? This is a major issue that epidemiologists, public health experts, other kinds of biomedical experts, geneticists are all trying to figure out. The federal government has a number of projects trying to close the gap in health, morbidity, and mortality in this country. And one one approach is that these gaps are caused by social conditions, unequal social conditions among blacks and whites and other. I'm going to focus mostly on African Americans, but there's similar gaps between Latinos and whites and Native Americans and whites and some Asian groups as well. And so that's one approach. Another approach is to argue that the reason for higher rates of mortality from certain diseases is that blacks are genetically different, and that's why. And that theory was the basis of a new drug, the first drug, race-specific drug approved by the FDA, Bidil, for heart failure. And the FDA approved it as a drug for black patients. And this is from Nitromed's website, the maker of Bidil. The FDA's approval was based on a clinical trial that only included African American patients, and they did find this huge reduction, a 43% reduction in mortality when the patients in the trial added this combination of two generic drugs in this pill Bidil, and they stopped the clinical trial. The FDA approved it, but not as most drugs are, well, as all other drugs are in the United States. You know, most of the pharmaceuticals on the market in the United States were tested mostly on white people, but they're not marketed as drugs just for white people. They're marketed as drugs for everyone. This drug was marketed as approved for marketing as a drug for black people, and the manufacturer, the person who created the drug, a doctor at University of Minnesota, was able to extend the patent on this drug by adding this application, this particular application, as a therapy for blacks. Okay, so why do black heart patients need a race-specific therapy? You know, why not just make it another drug that doctors could use for patients with heart failure? Well, the explanation from Nitromed in one of its press releases was that ethnic differences in the underlying pathophysiology of heart failure explain why this drug works better on blacks. And even the FDA, in its scientific explanation for why it approved Bidil, uses this idea that race is a proxy for genetic difference. In other words, there's some genetic difference that makes Bidil work better for people. And we don't know what it is yet, but until we can pinpoint it, we'll use race as a proxy for that genetic difference. Jonathan Kahn, a professor at Hamline Law School in Minnesota, has been tracking the patenting of or patent applications that have race-specific applications for pharmaceuticals and other products. And he has found a huge increase and argues that there is now, companies are using strategically race as a genetic category to obtain patent protection and drug approval. And even without FDA approval, there are companies that market race-specific products online, like these vitamins, where you take a different vitamin depending on your race. It seems like the key ingredient is vitamin D, and it's linked to skin color. And so I think the theory is if you're African American, you're darker than if you're Hispanic, and then you're darker if you're Hispanic than if you're Caucasian. And I can only think that they didn't include Asians because they weren't sure where, you know, Asians would fall. So, okay, now at the same time that we're seeing this race consciousness in medicine and other kinds of technologies, again, I'm happy to talk about them in the discussion time, but just for the sake of time, I couldn't go into all of these technologies. I'm writing a book on it, so hopefully that'll be out soon and you can read more about it there. Because I want to focus on the politics of it, all of these technologies are being developed in the context of race consciousness in governance, in punitive governance. Again, the theory is that post-civil rights America doesn't pay attention to race. But effectively, it's hard to say that race is not a factor in certain aspects of government, especially punitive aspects of government. And so if we look at incarceration rates in the United States, they skyrocketed in the 1980s and 90s. And that is primarily because of the huge incarceration rates of black men in this country. Even though there was a recent report that the rates of incarceration of whites is going up now as well, but nowhere near incarceration rates of black men, who are 10 times more likely than white men to be in prison. And perhaps even more striking and disturbing are the lifetime chances of being sent to prison of black men in this country. A third of black men in this country will be sent to prison at some time in their lives. But if you look at the predictions for black children, if the rates continue, it's 50%. You know, the predictions, if these rates continue, have a black child born in America today, who of course, you know, most black children today are born into poverty, and the chances are that they are just as likely to go to prison as not go to prison, unless something happens to stem